In this lecture, we're going to look at the other important economic activity in the Ottoman Empire, and that is trade and the markets of the cities, and also the circulation of money that's so important in sustaining the urban culture as well as the central administration of the port. Now, the study of trade and the role of trade in the Ottoman Empire has undergone some very, very important changes in the last generation in scholarship. In part, it was brought on by the works of Braudel, who wrote definitive works on the economy in the 16th century, the Mediterranean economy, and he would almost classify the Ottoman Empire as a mini economy in and of itself, sort of a reflection of the larger world economy he writes about in his later literature. This has prompted scholars in the Ottoman Empire to study all sorts of aspects of trade, manufacturing, and it goes from highly specialized analyses of the weaving trade, the carpet trade in Aleppo, all the way up to the international trade of the spices, the silks, and also the slave trade. And so what we want to do in this lecture is to give an overall picture of what was the role of trade in the Ottoman Empire. It also raises another important general historical question, and that is a question of, did the Ottomans somehow fail in their understanding of commerce? Again, this has to do with notions of Orientalism, that is, holding the Ottoman Empire to the standard of what happened in northwestern Europe. And the very far-flung and impressive trade of the Ottoman Empire in its classic age did not give rise to the kind of capital formation and ultimately industrialization that you see in Western Europe. And it's very unfair, really, to try to judge the Ottoman Empire against that change because, as I mentioned in the last lecture, that while there was no economic theory, per se, among the Ottoman ruling classes, they did have a very good understanding of how to secure prosperity for their empire, and they had a very, very good understanding, as we shall see, of the profits and value of trade in the overall maintenance of the empire. And so we want to put that issue on hold and consider it again when we finish this lecture, and then turn to the economic changes that took place in the 19th century. The first point we must keep in mind is that the majority of trade within the Ottoman Empire for all periods was regional and local. And that meant the ancient caravanserai, the ancient markets around mosques, really functioned as the main centers of the exchange of goods between the countryside and the urban residents. It was a very, very important place also where goods came in from farther regional trade networks into major cities to distribute all sorts of handicrafts and other goods across the general population. And it's a point that has to be emphasized, that perhaps 80% of all transactions occurred in those local markets and caravanserai, markets associated with the mosque complexes. And these traditions persisted well into the 19th century and even today. As I often tell people, that when you're in any Turkish city and you need a good meal, you head to the local market and you head to the mosque in the market because that's where all the merchants buy their food, their lunches, and you'll get a good lunch there. And that would have been true just as much in the 16th century. Now, given that point, that much of it was local and regional, nonetheless, international trade and the city of Constantinople played a disproportionately important part in the Ottoman economy for several reasons. First, let's look at Constantinople. Constantinople was an awesome city to maintain, and there wasn't anything really quite like it in other Islamic cities in the Ottoman Empire. It was over 1 million strong. It had an enormous number of supporting cities around it, and just the maintaining of that city daily was a staggering job. It's been calculated that in the year 1600, you would need a minimum of something like 200 tons of grain just to meet the bread market in Constantinople, which calculates out to about 73,000 tons a year. And that's just for grain. It doesn't include salted meats, oils, and a whole wide range of other products. According to registers of the 17th century, at least 6,000 ships, ferries, and other types of cargo vessels appeared in Constantinople in an average year. And sometimes these could double when you dealt with the massing of forces for a major military operation or in times of shortage and famine, where the Sultan would take efforts to relieve starvation within the city by demanding more commodities from the provinces. And so Constantinople acted as a great engine of trade and an engine of manufacturing for a pre-industrial economy, and it played a disproportionate role. Furthermore, the city was also home to some of the most important commercial and banking houses in the entire empire, and these were largely controlled by non-Muslims, dhimmi. This goes back to the conquest of the city in 1453, as well as the ideology of the Sultan Caliph. The Riyah were supposed to be the producers. The askari, that is the military ruling class, was not to get involved in commerce, at least not directly. And we won't go into the underhanded methods whereby the janissaries took protection money and dominated the guilds of the city. But they were not engaged in the kinds of contracts of tax farming or in all of the commercial activities to supply the city. That fell largely into the hands of Christians. In 1453, that had traditionally been in the hands of Venetians and Genoese. In the late Byzantine state, the emperors of Constantinople had alienated many of their commercial rights in the forms of documents known as crystal bulls, which handed over properties, ritzy waterfront properties, customs duties to the Italian merchants who had the connection, the banking skills, and the knowledge of languages to supply the city and to handle the international trade that went through Constantinople. In 1453, Mehmet II renegotiated those contracts and issued what later became known as capitulations. That's an English translation of the Ottoman Turkish word, adamnames, which means sort of a submission. And it's an important point because when these documents were issued first to the Venetians and Genoese, later to the French and the English and Dutch, they were done from a position of strength of the Sultan to the foreigners. And what it was permission for these merchants to operate within the Ottoman Empire. They were allowed to set up their own communities. In 1453, that was the community of Pera. That is the old Genoese quarter on the northern side of the Golden Horn. Today, essentially, Istiklal Caddesi and the Galatea quarter that many of you might be familiar with. It's just down from Taksim Square. And there, the Genoese and Venetians, later French and Western Europeans, notably Dutch and English, showed up, and over the course of 200 years, set up their own commercial and banking institutions. They were given favored treatment. They only paid a low custom fee of 3%. They could appeal directly to the Sultan in any kind of commercial disputes, but the Sultan controlled the movement of these foreigners within his empire, and he dictated the terms. Over the course of the 16th and early 17th century, the Italians were increasingly replaced by Christians and Jews who were Ottoman subjects. And there was a good reason for doing this. First, these people had the linguistic and banking skills to carry out the kind of jobs that Venetians and Genoese did. And above all, they were Ottoman subjects. The Greeks settled in the district known as the Fener district. They emerged as the commercial elite for a number of activities in the city. The Jews in the Balat district, originally Greek speakers, but later reinforced by refugees from Spain and then by more Jews from the Rhineland and Poland, they took over a lot of government contracts and shipping. They were also engaged in ferries, operating the supply of the city. Armenians, too, arrived very early in the city, and they gained an important economic role. And so by 1600, the Greeks, the Jews, the Armenians together made up probably a majority of the population of Constantinople. Jews may have been as much as 25% of the population of the city. But they were all subjects of the Sultan. They all took over the positions that were once handled by the Venetians and Genoese. And furthermore, they were remarkably loyal to the Sultan Caliph and very, very much depended on the favor of the government and tied their interests closely to the government. It's not very often noticed, but many of the Greeks in the Fener district, for instance, in the 19th century, who doubled also as translators for the Ottoman government, were very, very reluctant to get involved in the Greek Revolution, which would sweep away their privileges under the old system of the Porte. And that's a subject that sometimes becomes a sensitive issue. So Constantinople gave rise to new opportunities for a Christian and Jewish elite class in the city that took over a good deal of the trading and merchandising. It also provided an engine of change to feed the growing city, and with all of the consumables and vendables that were necessary to make the city a great city. In addition to the role of Constantinople, there was also the international trade routes that had been inherited by the Ottomans and extended. And here again, a lot of research has gone into the international trade and its significance in the overall Ottoman economy. One way is to take the old traditional minimalist view, which was it was essentially an agrarian economy, and trade was sort of just a kind of gingerbread dressing on a very, very simple agrarian cake. On the other hand, the international trade yielded enormous profits in customs revenues. As we'll see, the silk trade, the slave trade, the trade in spices and pearls, especially coming out of the Persian Gulf, all of that netted enormous profits for the port as well as for the provincial governments. In addition, this trade had important political and diplomatic consequences. It led to certain alignments and objectives of grand strategy by the Ottoman court. And so it's not easily set aside as being unimportant. And finally, it's necessary to stress that in some of the older literature, it's often thought that the Ottoman government was rather hostile to international trade or somehow inhibited the classic Silk Road, and that becomes increasingly not the case as more and more documents have been studied, particularly Ottoman custom revenues of the 16th century, as well as other sorts of documents from the Indian Ocean and even from Safavid Iran. The Ottoman elite were more than aware of the importance of international trade and what it could do for the Sultan Caliph. Well, let's look at three of the most prominent international trade operations that were so important in sustaining and augmenting the Ottoman economy in the 16th and 17th century. The first one I'd like to look at is the silk trade, the fabled Silk Road, because that generated an awful lot of controversy. The Silk Road, which emerged sometime maybe as early as the 2nd century BC, certainly in operation at the time in the Roman Empire, was the classic route from China to the Mediterranean world. And it passed through the great cities of Transoxiana, dominated by Turkic and Persian-speaking merchants, and then would go to Tabriz and then enter into the Ottoman domains. By 1400, Bursa had emerged as the main silk market in the Ottoman Empire. And Bursa to this day still has an ancient silk market there built in the 16th century with a great bedestin. These are the fortified Ottoman marketplaces that are just built all over the Ottoman Empire to facilitate this type of trade. They are the successors of the old caravanserai in some ways. And Bursa was ideal because it also was a good place to grow mulberry trees. They had a fair amount of local silk manufacture. A lot of the silk coming in was raw silk, which would then be transformed into garments to meet the market. And some of the biggest profits were really in the markups of turning silk from a raw commodity into the elaborate robes and the other types of garments expected by the elite classes of the Ottoman Empire. It also was important for the European market. The Ottomans controlled a good deal of the silk production in the Eastern Mediterranean, not only at Bursa, but at the Morea. And whatever silk production you had in France since the 13th century could not meet the market, and Italians, Genoese, and Venetians showed up every year at Bursa to buy vast amounts of raw silk to be shipped to their cities and turned into garments to hit the European trade. And the customs levied on these transactions were enormously profitable. We can tell from the Genoese records that in the 15th century, that an annual supply of silk would produce somewhere on the order of 370,000 ducats, gold ducats of income in terms of revenues, which was 3.5 times anything you got out of woolens and probably 6 times what you got out of cotton. And so the Italians just flocked to Bursa. Mudanya was the port through which the silk was exported to the Italian cities. And this proved an immensely profitable trade. It was disrupted during the 17th century, but it wasn't due to any really Ottoman policy. It was a result of these wars between the Safavid Shahs and the Ottoman sultans, which disrupted caravan routes. There is evidence to the effect that Shah Abbas I, or Abbas the Great, the man who reversed the military situation, also tried to carry out some kind of embargo. There was also the intrusion of the Portuguese into the Indian Ocean. That had an effect on the export and import of silk in the 16th century, but it wasn't really a result of Ottoman policy. And it wasn't just the Ottomans that suffered. There was also the Venetians and Genoese who would complain when these supplies were disrupted. And the renewal of a sensible treaty in 1639 between the Ottomans and the Safavids, as well as the decline of Portuguese power in the Indian Ocean after the 1580 and the arrival of the Dutch and English, meant that the silk trade revived and continued to be a major source of income for the Ottoman Empire down to the 19th century. Another important international trade route was the slave trade. In this case, most of the slave trade in the Ottoman Empire came from the north. There were some slave trading into Africa, and there was a brief effort by the Ottomans to actually to set up a base at Mombasa. It didn't work. And there was a small supply of African slaves coming in to the Ottoman Empire. But the real numbers were to be found in Russia and Eastern Europe. And here, this slave trade emerged in 1475, and it was when the city of Kaffa had been captured. As you remember, Kaffa had been a Genoese colony. It was taken over by the Ottoman fleet. It was handed over to the Khans of the Crimea, the Tatars, the descendants of the old Mongol Golden Horde. And these Tatars were largely Turkish speakers. They were Mongols in their political ideology, but they're really Turkish speakers and Muslims. They carried out repeated raids into Poland, Lithuania, into Russia in order to round up slaves. And from 1475, really down to the reign of Catherine the Great, it's not until the 1790s when the Russian armies occupied Kaffa. Kaffa was the main slave port for the Ottoman Empire. It's estimated that some of these raids could capture up to 10,000 prisoners. And in some instances, we hear of roundups as big as 50,000. That may well be exaggeration by the Christian sources. And the best calculation, which is a fairly conservative number, from 1475 down to about 1790, at least 3 million people were enslaved in Eastern Europe and sold from Kaffa onto the Ottoman markets. And they provided an enormous labor force that was very, very important for the urban economy of the Ottoman Empire. It wasn't just the households of the Sultan, the harem, the janissaries, but also the households of the governors, of the Ottoman elites. And based on casual records in the literature and the poetry of the Ottoman Empire, it's clear that many modest households in the great urban centers of the Ottoman Empire had 1 or 2 slaves. And these were overwhelmingly slaves captured in the great raiding expeditions in Northern Europe. Periodically, you would have gluts of slaves coming in when you had a successful military campaign, but that was not the trade that sustained it. The prices on these slaves would average anywhere from 50 to 100 Venetian ducats per person, depending on age, sex, and skills. Furthermore, some scholars have argued as much as 30% of the custom revenues collected in Constantinople every year came just from the slave trade. This slave trade was an absolute essential feature to the Ottoman state. It's one reason why the Ottomans were so closely aligned with the Crimean Tatars, and it was one of the driving reasons that led first the Poles and then the Russians to attack the Crimean Khanate and eventually to close down this operation. And the loss of the Crimean Tatars was not only important strategically. Henceforth, the Russians had ports on the Black Sea. It also cut off the slave trade. And by the time the slave trade was essentially abolished by the reformers of Tanzimat. And these are the conservative reformers who take over in 1839 and carry out a series of modernization reforms up until really the Parliament of 1876. Starting in a series of decrees, the slave trade was outlawed in the 1830s and 1850s, but already as a significant economic force, it had been spent. They had lost Kaffa, they had lost their sources, and the Ottoman state never again had those revenues from that international trade. A third important international trade was the spice trade. And this went to India, particularly for pepper, as well as spices farther east. It brought in the precious stones from southern India and Sri Lanka. A subsidiary branch of it was the pearls that came out of the Persian Gulf. Now, these were all luxury goods. They were in high demand in Constantinople, as well as the great capital cities of the provinces, such as Cairo and Damascus. And this, again, is a very ancient trading network that the Ottomans inherited. And in the 16th century, the Ottomans made a real effort to secure these routes. In 1517, Selim I had conquered Egypt. He succeeded to the trade routes in the Red Sea and the Indian Ocean. And these were routes that had been maintained by the Mamluks. And when the Ottomans came into this area, they found themselves at loggerheads with the Portuguese. As you recall, in 1498, Vasco da Gama had circumnavigated Africa, and the Portuguese broke into the Indian Ocean. And we'll discuss more about what those implications are in terms of geopolitics in a later lecture. But in terms of economics, the Portuguese were very much practitioners of a mercantilist theory. They wanted to get a control on the spice trade, the precious stones, and route everything to Lisbon. And they made efforts to try to close off the crucial straits into the Ottoman Empire. That included the Horn of Africa, and therefore entrance into the Red Sea, as well as the Straits of Hormuz that have prominently been featured in the current news. Both of those routes brought the products directly into the Ottoman Empire, and that led to a complicated series of wars in the 16th century. But what the Porte really wanted, particularly an intelligent vizier like Soklu Mehmet Pasha, they wanted to cut a deal with the Portuguese whereby they were not so much objecting to the Portuguese carrying trade as an embargo or the high prohibitive prices being charged, and they were willing to work out an arrangement whereby they would pay certain rates and a certain amount of the commodities would be fixed. And there were at least 2 treaties offered to the Portuguese along these lines, which were turned down. And what changed the situation around was the defeat of the Portuguese army at the Battle of Algeciras in 1578, the incorporation of Portugal into Spain, and the collapse of that Portuguese trade network in the Indian Ocean and its replacement by Dutch and English. And the Dutch and English were more than willing to make various kinds of accommodations to resupply the Ottoman state in the spices and all those precious stones. And again, that was a trade that netted enormous profits. The best recent study on it indicates that the Ottoman government in Egypt, down to the reign of Muhammad Ali, from 1805 to 1848, probably sustained about 20% of its revenues just on the taxes of the spice trade alone. So all 3 of these international trade routes were extremely important for the overall prosperity of the empire, as well as funding the Porte. And the great thing about international trade, this was paid up front in hard cash. Now, on that score, the Ottoman Empire was an extremely successful empire in exploiting the traditional long-distance luxury trades that we associate with pre-industrial empires. There were, however, 2 potential weaknesses in this network, which really were outside the control of the Porte. The first was currency. Because of the vagaries of mining operations and the availability of gold and silver, starting at the end of the 16th century, an enormous amount of silver came flooding in from the New World. That is the so-called Spanish-American Silver Revolution, which has been studied time and time again in early modern European history. This drove down prices of the relationship between gold and silver in the Middle East and the Ottoman Empire, and furthermore, it drove up inflationary prices. The Ottoman Empire itself had limited specie resources. Its basic silver coin, the akçe, was essentially used for internal purposes. The Ottoman state could never issue a currency that was internationally accepted. Far from it, they used foreign currency. They particularly favored the Venetian ducat, and then later in the 18th century, they shifted to the Habsburg thaler, the Maria Theresa thaler of 1780, the great silver coin. And in effect, the Ottoman government relinquished very, very important profits in the minting of currency, in the yanking of foreign coins and turning it into Ottoman coin, and they became, from the start, very heavily dependent on imported specie. And this had some major repercussions in financing the Ottoman state. It led to some bankruptcies at the end of the 16th and early 17th century, where the state defaulted on payment into the army, and you got the usual result of it, riots of janissaries. And these have been extremely well studied by Ottoman economic historians in recent years. Another important problem with the trade network was the appearance of the Dutch, English, and French in the Mediterranean waters starting at the end of the 17th century. They displaced the Italians as the main people to exchange goods between the Ottoman world and the Christian world. And the arrangements initially were accommodated by those old systems known as the capitulations. That is, the Sultan granted in the early 16th century capitulations to Dutch and English. This gave them the right to trade within ports of the Ottoman Empire, particularly in the Levant. Beirut was one, Alexandria in Egypt, the city of Izmir in Asia Minor, as well as facilities in Constantinople and Salonika in northern Greece. These were some of the great ports. However, over the course of time, the Europeans found themselves in a superior position, and by the time these capitulations were abolished in 1923, they were seen as agents of imperialism. But they didn't start out that way. The first one granted to the French, to the representatives of Francis I by Suleiman the Magnificent, was right in lines with traditional capitulations given to Venice and Genoa. And the later ones to the English and Dutch also kept them under close supervision. But what happened is the European ships took over the carrying trade in the Mediterranean. They had superior ships that could plug into the wider global economy, which was transoceanic. The Ottomans did not have those ships. Furthermore, the Mediterranean world was becoming increasingly not the center of the world, but just an extension of a much wider trade network, and that trade network was in the hands of the Europeans of Northwest Europe. Finally, the Western Europeans were driven by economic concepts quite different to the Ottoman state in either its rural economy or in its trade. Europeans thought in terms of capturing markets. This is already evident in the 18th century with mercantilist theories, or in the 19th century with free trade theories championed by the British and well enshrined in the commercial treaty between Great Britain and the Ottoman Empire in 1838. The idea was to manufacture large numbers of goods that could be marketed to ever-expanding markets, that these in turn led to capital formation, to the investment in new ways of producing goods, to create new buying interests in the public. In other words, the modern consumerism that we now associate with market economies in the modern world. Once this concept breaks into the Ottoman Empire, the Ottomans find themselves in a peculiar position. There were many goods that the Ottoman economy could not produce. And already from the mid-18th century, some very clever scholars have studied wills from Constantinople of the Ottoman elites. And what those wills reveal is from 1700 to 1800, an increasing number of imported European goods. These include fine crystal, they include watches, precision instruments, weapons, furniture, a whole range of goods that the Ottoman economy could never produce. And the result is the Ottoman economy becomes plugged in to these European imports. And over the course of the 19th century, the manufactured goods come in, and increasingly the handicraft industries or manufacturing in the Ottoman Empire, they still respond to local markets, but they can't compete internationally. There's no way, even for instance, with ordinary textiles to compete with the Europeans, either the French or the British. They don't have the looms. When they try to set up a manufacturing of textiles with looms, as they do in Egypt under Muhammad Ali or later in Asia Minor, they can't compete because the technology is changing so fast, and the French and English just will always outproduce them and undercut them. And the result is that by 1914, at the outbreak of the First World War, because of these changes in the international world economy, the Ottoman Empire in some ways finds itself as an economic hypocolony. 75% of its imports are coming from Austria-Hungary, Germany, France, and Britain. Overwhelmingly, the banking system is controlled by foreigners, and we'll talk about that with the reforms of Tanzimat. And above all the Ottoman Empire is exporting back is essentially raw materials to sustain the expanding markets of the European powers. And through no fault of their own, the Ottoman state finds itself in an uneven position. Those capitulations that had been issued back in the 16th and 17th centuries from a position of authority were now seen as a way of keeping the Ottoman economy in subjection to the European powers. And that was one reason that the Ottoman state felt the necessity to engage in the Great First World War in order to shake off that position as a hypocolony and to assert itself once again as a great power. And the consequences of that decision we'll see later in the course.